Hey guys. Okay, so we are going to use the sheet that I sent you to take notes about on this mini lecture. Actually, I hope it's mini. I hope it's not too long. On what you guys read in Luke 15. And the sheet, mine's got some scribbling on it, but the sheet should look like this. And I'm hoping that you can fit all the notes on here, but this is the format that I think might be the easiest to use in taking these notes. So let's see here. So first of all, let's talk about some of the terms that you were supposed to cover for homework, and one of them was parable. And I can't ask you what the answer is because we're not in person, so it's a short allegorical story that uses comparison to teach a truth. And then the other term, or not, it wasn't a term, but another piece that I asked you guys to do was to identify the audience of this story. And you have to do a little close reading to be able to do that. So if you look back at your text, and I use the ESV version, so that's what you guys should have. At the beginning of chapter 15, I'm going to read the first 3 verses, so that you can be super clear about what is or who is the audience. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him," Jesus. "And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and he eats with them.' So he told them this parable." Well, the them is not the tax collectors and the sinners, it's the Pharisees and the scribes. The audience is comprised of who Jesus is really talking to is the Pharisees and the scribes. And in that culture, these are the most honored people in that culture. And remember, we're talking about a shame, honor culture, so this piece is important. And the catalyst for Jesus telling this story, let's look back again at those verses. "They were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man,'" Jesus, "receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable." So the "so" there lets you know what the catalyst is. Jesus tells the story because the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled against him, and they said, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So get the contrast right here. We've got the honorable, most respected portion of that culture condemning Jesus because he is fraternizing with the lowest of the low, and so that is shameful in this culture. So let's take a strong look, or a deep look, actually a quick look, at the first 2 parables. There's one about the lost sheep is first, and there's one about, let's see if this is covered, oh, yeah, and there's one about the lost coin. And in both of these, we have these elements, and I'm going to put the shared elements right here. Something is lost, and because it's lost, it actually becomes more precious than the other 99 sheep, than the other 9 coins. So what's lost is very precious, and then when it is found, there's a big celebration that involves the community. The third parable, which is the one called the prodigal son, and remember that these tags, lost coin, lost sheep, prodigal son, they weren't there in the ancient Greek versions. These are added on when King James and his buddies created the text that we're most closely connected to in our modern day, and to make it more readable for people like us, they divided the scripture into sections. So this isn't necessarily really the parable of the prodigal son. That might be important in a little bit. But the prodigal son, just for language purposes and clarity, we're going to link it. So what do the first, the second, and the third parables share? Well, they all involve something lost, and it becomes precious because it's lost. And when it is found, there is a celebration. The first two are just about the lost and found and celebration. But the last one, that's when the shame or the honor and shame worldview is folded in, which gives you a sharper picture of what Jesus's message is. Okay, so let's comb through the main characters of this parable, and they are the younger son, excuse me, the older son, and the father. So here's what we have. The details, I've written this on another sheet of paper. The details about the younger son, I asked you guys for homework to write down what are 5 specific things that you can tell about each of these characters. And I think I asked you to write what you thought were the most important things. And lucky you don't even have to answer that question because I'm going to answer it for you. So for the first one, he's a callous son. He wants the father's money. But not the father. Another thing about him is that he takes that early inheritance payout and he squanders it on reckless living, which includes parties, drinking, and women. Because remember, I am addicted to specific supports. And if you were to write a paper to make the assertion that he squanders it on reckless living, I would want you to support that with specific examples from the text. That's an aside. And now we're back on topic. Number 3, after he loses all of his money, he becomes desperate and hungry. Here is a man who's never faced his personal need, and he is so deep into the need at this point that he is willing to do what is unthinkable for a young Jewish man to do in the first century. He's willing to go and feed the pigs. An interaction with pigs, that's shameless in the shame and honor culture. Another piece about him, and I love this quote, he came to himself. We talked about in previous, like with the Kabuli Wala, the Indian story, we talked about how the father in that story had an awakening, and if you remember the term, it's called an epiphany, and that's what this son is having. This hunger causes him to wake up. He has an epiphany, and he sees something he hadn't understood before. So when he came to himself and he has that epiphany, this is what he sees. Before, he didn't care two hoots about his father, but now he understands my father treated his servants better than I'm being treated. So I'm going to go home to my father, and notice this part. He says that he's going to tell his father, I have sinned. I am unworthy to be your son. Just treat me as a servant. So those are important things, because he moves from pride up here. And that movement, because of this catalyst, this epiphany, he moves to humility. And humility, really, the definition could be it's seeing things as they actually are. So I want us to get the specifics of this, that the proof of the humility is he recognizes that he has sinned. I've sinned. I'm unworthy to be your son. And please let me be a servant. This, I just want to reiterate something a little bit in maybe different words, is the fact that he recognizes that he's sinned and he's unworthy. That points to the humility of his position. But something that's also interesting is that he recognizes who his father is. The text doesn't give us this, but when he leaves, this was a highly shameful thing for him to do, because according to the honor-shame code of that culture, he throws off, he reneges on his obligation to stay with his father and look after him and care for him as he gets older. That's one of the greatest commandments, is to honor your father and mother. And he seemingly without thought, rejects that, and thereby dishonors his father, thereby shames his father greatly. But now he's got a clearer picture not only of who he is, but who his father is. He recognizes, my father treats his servants better. So there's an intimation of his understanding of his father's goodness and wanting to move toward that. Let's go over to the father. Some of the things that we notice about the father. I'm going to kind of scooch it over here because I can tell I'm not going to have much room. So the father, something that's very interesting at the very beginning is the father. Think about this. This is a culture that's patriarchal. The top dog is the father, and yet the father gives the younger son his choice. He could have, in this culture, it would have been expected that the father would have disciplined his son and thereby maintained his own honor, because he's been greatly shamed. Did you hear that yada yada's son took half the money and ran? That's greatly shaming to the father. But the father has a surprising point of view in this whole parable. So he gives son his choice. The second thing is that we learned here is that he is a generous man. And so let's just jot down that he is a generous man to his workers. A third thing is that when this guy who has shamed him, been doing unthinkable things, and then the last job was with pigs. Not only does the father forgive him, he runs to the son. Think about the shame honor thing. In a situation like this, if the father, say, were to receive the son again, I mean, he wouldn't lose his dignity by hitching up his robes and running to his son. But the father's viewpoint is such that earning honor or maintaining honor is not his first priority. So he runs to his son because he feels compassion. And he embraces him. And he even kisses him. And he wants to throw a party. Wait a second. Oh, wait. Let's get to that in a second. Okay. So when he does this, these things signify that the father, it lets everybody in the culture know that the father has accepted the son. So this is a symbol of accepting back the son. And he goes further. I mean, the guy can't even get out his apology. He's planned this speech, this 3-point speech, and he can't even get it out because his father doesn't even care what he has to say. He's just glad to see his son. So as a result, like you have here with something was lost, and because it's lost, it's more precious in a way, and then it's found, and then there's celebration. The father celebrates with his community. He's not embarrassed. He's not ashamed that his bad son has come back home and that he's maybe seen as weak for accepting his son. Instead, he celebrates, and you know how I'm addicted to specifics. So to support that specific assertion, he gives him a ring, the best coat, a fattened calf. Then we're going to come to number 5 here in just a second, but let's scoot over to the older son. I'm going to erase a little bit, so right now, please take some time and shut me off, so that you can make sure you've got all these notes. Okay, so older son. We know that in the beginning, not in the beginning of the story, but when he first shows up in the story, he is in the field working. 2. When the father receives the younger son and he hears about it, he is angry about his brother's reception. In fact, he's so angry that in this culture he shames his father, because if the father has publicly accepted the younger son's return, the role of the other son is to, in this celebration, join with the father, welcome people, be kind of co-host. And then if he has an offense or something he's concerned about, he should never shame his father in public. Instead, he should privately speak about it with the father afterwards. But he refuses to go into the party. And how does the father react? Shockingly. Not only does he hitch up his robes and run after the younger son, but when The older son shames the father. What does the father do? He should be angry and wrestle honor out of this situation, but instead it says he entreats his son. So he actually goes after this son. He leaves party, and entreat is another way of saying begs his older son to join. Oops. Begs older son to join party. Well, what is the son's response? The son says, I've served you for years and always obeyed. Yet I'm writing all this down because this quote's critical to the unlocking the meaning of this parable. Yet you never gave me a goat. So a lot of things are happening here. The father responds to that with, everything I have is yours. But why can the son, the older son, not recognize that he's had everything his father has to give all along? What has prevented that from happening? Because, and this is a twist, just like the younger son doesn't want the father, he wants the money, the older son doesn't really want the father, he wants the money. He's played by all the rules in order to get what he wants, and he assumes, I'm going to put it on here. This lets you know that the older son assumes his father owes him. When we have a heart that assumes God owes us, of course, the Father is representative of God in our life, and God is offering love to his two sons, and neither of them really wants it. But then it's only when the younger son comes in touch with his desperation and need that then he has a clearer picture that is sharpened by humility to recognize who he really is and what kind of man his father is. But because this guy hasn't wanted the father's son, he just wants what he wants, and he thinks that he can get it through being good, he's unable to receive it. He's had it all along, but he can't receive it. It's a block for him. So paradoxically or ironically, both sons reject God. The younger son does it through a debauched lifestyle. The older son rejects his father through following the rules. He doesn't need his father. He just needs to do what he needs to do in order to get stuff from the father. So he rejects God by following, or his father by following the rules. So they both reject the Father or God in this way, because that's the comparison here. All right, let's scoot over here, and I'm going to put some other words that we talked about up here. So one of the words that I asked you guys to define was diction. And that's simply the word choice that someone uses when they are writing a poem or telling a story or writing a novel or writing a play. When people write stuff or tell stories, they use particular words for particular reasons. And then the next one is prodigal. Why is this word used? And I asked you to look up both definitions that were adjective definitions. There are two adjective definitions of this word, and one of them is spending money or resources recklessly. The second one is having money and giving generously. So, how could those two separate definitions be helpful at all? Kind of like a word can be an or that can move us to greater understanding. How could that word be an or to help us look or consider this parable more deeply? Well, this one's probably pretty easy. The spending money recklessly is going to be the younger son, right? That's what he does. But does the father have money and give it generously? So is the father also a prodigal? And let's take it a step further. Was it reckless of the father to spend money and honor his son after the way he's been treated? Could the father be a reckless spender just like the son in a different way? He's certainly not self-protective. He's certainly not hanging on to things like reputation. And how does this connect to the audience that Jesus is talking to? Jesus is talking to the most honorable and respected echelon of first century Jewish culture. How does this story connect with them? Well, they do everything right, and so does the older brother. So when we're doing the comparisons, the older brother is similar to the Pharisees and scribes. And the older brother has a blind spot. He can't see what his father has already given him. And this can lead us to the theme statement for this story, which you might write down as, I've written it down here so that I won't forget what I came up with. One, remember how you're not supposed to use first or second person in a theme statement, and it's supposed to be in present tense. One is unable to receive God's grace until he recognizes he is unworthy of it. It's a paradox. There's two statements that don't seem like they should fit together, but when you put them together, they actually point to one of those capital T truths, which paradoxes, that's what they do. And Jesus is telling the Pharisees and the scribes through a story, which is a powerful way to communicate, because when you are told a story, you're invited to identify with characters in the story. And he's telling them the goal of honor that you seek prevents you, and the thought that you have done everything there is to do to please God, and so God owes you. This is going to prevent you from entering the kingdom of God. This is going to prevent you from experiencing God's profound love. So that, in a capsule, is a way to think about this story.